tell me any characteristic of the Southern colonies from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, etc. Yes?
Plantations.
So what you would say is the defining characteristic of the southern region is plantations, large farms, dispersed kind of settlements, and with those plantations, what eventually comes that's going to be distinctive about those regions and significant? Slavery. Now, slavery is going to define on some level the southern colonies. And the other thing I'd mention about those southern colonies to remember is kind of this stratification. The plantation owners, the Tidewater gentry, the plantation owners of Southern Carolina are going to be the dominant political, economic, and cultural people in that society. There is going to be class stratification. That differs from New England. How is New England different in that regard, Alice and Perry? What do you remember about New England as a region? Yes, religion is certainly important. Puritanism in general. How about Sam's settlement patterns in New England? Yes, towns and communities centered around churches, schools, that are going to teach kids so that they can, they can read the Bible. Families, extended families, long lives, long healthy lives, small farms, define New England. How about the middle colonies? What's distinctive about Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, and New Jersey? Go ahead.
Diversity with language and culture from all of the Dutch, German, etc. And immigrants, and also sort of the middle ground where there were some community settings, but also more spread out.
Yeah, nicely put, George. I mean, there is that ethnic and religious diversity in the middle colonies. The less than half the population of those colonies are actually English. And there also is kind of this middle way, where you don't have necessarily huge farms, but they're not necessarily small farms. And you don't have necessarily tiny towns, but you don't have widespread, kind of settlements on plantations. And so the middle colonies are going to be kind of different than the northern colonies, or the New England colonies, and different than the southern colonies. And these differences are certainly important. But the question that we posed in class was, after we established all of these colonies and their little stories about the settlements that they had and the differences between the regions, we said that somehow these diverse colonies that were settled for different reasons by different people at different times and had different economic bases and cultural bases and societal and ethnic and religion and all this, somehow they unified together to revolt against their mother country. And so how did that transpire? So we did talk about some commonalities that these colonies had. And one of those commonalities is that they were all affected by and participated in an empire that was governed by an ideology, an economic ideology known as mercantilism. What, if anything, Weissman, do you recall of mercantilism?
Mother country acquired colonies to coal, acquiring coal.
So Weissman, may I stop you for a moment and say that mercantilism dealt with an imperial system. And an imperial system is a mother country and colonies. And mercantilism dealt with the relationship between the mother country and the colonial possessions. And you are saying that in terms of that relationship, what was the ultimate goal of mercantilism? To build your pile of gold, right? To acquire wealth. Now, remember, the idea of mercantilism is the government of the empire, would regulate the economic activity of the empire for the good of the empire. Right? So mercantilism suggested that the imperial power, England, would regulate trade throughout the empire in order to foster its goal, to build a favorable balance of trade. And what that usually kind of boiled down to is that the colonial possessions would do economically things that the mother country could not do for themselves. Right? So their job was to provide things for the empire that could not be provided by the mother country. In England, they could manufacture, they could process final products, but they couldn't grow tobacco. England could transport things across the sea, but they couldn't grow rice or indigo or hemp or any of those other things, or produce timber. And so they looked to their colonial possessions, and they tried to relegate the colonies to doing the things that the mother country could not do. Also, the colonies represented a domestic market, right? The mother country would produce products and sell it domestically, require the colonial possessions to buy those products. Now, in order to implement mercantilism, and the end goal was a favorable balance of trade, and a favorable balance of trade would result in an acquisition of gold for the empire. It would become wealthier. Now, the laws that begin to implement mercantilism, this would be super duper good if you could remember the names of the first legislation that was passed by Parliament to implement mercantilism in the empire. Do you remember, dear hand? Son of a gun. Jim, do you recall? Darn it, Bobby.
Was it the Navigation
It
Act?
was indeed the Navigation Acts. Can I give you, Eric, a date on those? 1660 to 1663, the Navigation Acts were passed to kind of implement mercantilism and to kind of relegate the colonies to doing certain things that would benefit the empire. You know, prohibiting, you know, kind of the transport of products only on British ships. And one of the big things that the Navigation Acts did is generate a list of enumerated products. These would be products that could only be sold to England, like tobacco. Now that notion that the only people that could buy American tobacco were the British is probably really at the core of maybe the Revolutionary War for Virginia. I mean, the Virginia plantation owners were forced to sell their product entirely to English merchants. And the price was determined by them. And you know, the result was kind of perpetual debt. So mercantilism becomes the economic and political system that is used to govern the colonies. And we said that at the end of the day, mercantilism resulted in the mother country getting richer and the colonies getting poorer. And so we asked a question, you know, when we covered this in class, we said, well, okay, if the Navigation Acts were passed in 1660, and, you know, the kind of first rumblings of the Revolution aren't until 1760, why does it take 100 years for the colonists to kind of rise up, Taylor, and oppose mercantilism? What did we say? Go ahead, Al.
Was it the Sean Whelan Memorial?
Yes, it was the Sean Whelan Memorial salutary neglect. That mercantilistic legislation was not vigorously enforced. And the colonies found ways to circumvent, particularly in New England, that didn't fit neatly into mercantilism. Now, so all the colonies were part of this. I mean, some fit neater than others, but all were kind of under mercantilism. Some other things that kind of connected the colonies together were some cultural things, like the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a big deal. And if we were going to associate one word with the Enlightenment, what would it be? What would it be, yes?
Religion?
Well, actually, I'd say quite the opposite of that.
Yes, just kidding. That was a joke.
Secularism?
Secularism is a good word, you know, and I wouldn't, if you argued it, I wouldn't disagree, yes.
Science?
Science is a good word too, yeah.
Rights?
What's that, rights? Yeah, go ahead.
Knowledge.
Yeah, those are all good. I guess my word is I was thinking reason. You know, that really what the Enlightenment was reason over religion. Right? Human intellect, right? Humanism, human intellect could kind of understand the world. I mean, the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that started in Europe and spread to America that said, look, the world is an understandable place. It is governed by certain natural laws. And those laws can be understood, and humans can take actions to make things better. The fatalistic kind of idea that everyone was doomed by original sin, and that the best they could do was kind of honor the church and honor the king, gives way to kind of enlightened optimism that things can be better. is the American Revolution an enlightened revolution? I mean, think about it. What's central to the American Revolution? This is jumping ahead a little bit, but what's central to the notion? If I said, what's the core of the American Revolution? You know, what's the core of it? What did they say was the core of it? You know, the American Revolution. Jumping ahead a little bit. Go ahead, Paul.
Taxation,
Well, sure, you know, that was true, but I mean, when the Declaration of Independence comes along and, you know, Jefferson is explaining why Americans revolted, what's central to that, Sam? Darn you, blasted grave. Well, yeah, I'd say the equality of man, but the importance of man. All men are created equal. The power of government emanates from the consent of the governed. In a sense, that's a very enlightened notion. You know, the enlightenment is that humans are important, that humans can figure things out, right? That humans can make things better. And, you know, the idea that human beings through scientific reason and other means can make the world a better place, you know, is kind of the core notion of the Enlightenment. And if you think about the American Revolution, I mean, ultimately the American Revolution gives life to the Enlightenment in the form of a country and a government. So the Enlightenment is an important thing. Now we said, look, you know, Benjamin Franklin is the quintessential example of an enlightened thinker, a scientist, a politician, you know, a printer, a newspaper editor. Franklin is kind of the symbol of that in the world. Jefferson is an example of an enlightened thinker. But most people in the United States really weren't, you know, directly affected by the Enlightenment. They were more affected by religion. And the religious movement that influences America the most is the First Great Awakening, right, during this time period. And what names do we associate with the First Great Awakening? There should be two names, and I want you to know, Brendan, I want you to know both of these names. Go ahead, Gina. Yes, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, you studied in an English class and you read his classic sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Sam, did you read that classic sermon? And so you are familiar with Jonathan Edwards. He was the Connecticut minister that preached these sermons. And what I think Great Awakening attempted to do was revive sort of a religious fervor that had gone cold in the aftermath of settlement. You know, in New England in particular, you had this fervor of, you know, kind of the city on a hill and, you know, this opportunity and then given way to secularism, materialism, and notions of the Enlightenment. And Alec has a thought, yes?
Would you say that the First Great Awakening was like kind of response to the Enlightenment?
A response to the Enlightenment, yeah, very much so. Very much so a response to kind of this idea that God is not important, that man can do everything. And the intellectualism of religion, you know, kind of this idea that, oh yes, I'm a sinner, I'm saved by grace, but let's go out and make money. The Great Awakening was this kind of idea that, look, you've got to feel it. You've got to, you know, and Edwards kind of pounds away at these kind of images that causes people to viscerally understand their decadence. And to understand kind of the grace of God and to feel it, and it flows over them. And Edwards preaches these sermons, but it is Whitefield that comes on this evangelical tour through, you know, America, preaching all in every single colony to huge crowds that come and respond to this message of kind of this emotional experience of salvation. And that this stirs, you know, the population. It's the first genuine, legitimate American experience. And we said Whitefield is the first legitimate American superstar. And the wake of the Great Awakening is significant. We said it divides religion. It denominationalizes. It splits religions, divides between old lights and new lights, and people who, you know, resist kind of the emotionalism of the awakening, and the people that support it, and, you know, there's all these implications. But we said one of the things that might have been significant about the First Great Awakening is that it represented the common folk challenging the religious authority of the clergy. I mean, was my minister saved? Can I preach? Is inspiration enough? And, look, the inculcated cultural notion that Americans had to overcome was this idea that they had to defer to their betters, to the church, to the king, to the aristocracy. And, the idea of revolting against that is going to be, difficult. And so does the First Great Awakening contribute to a mindset that eventually will propel a revolution? Well, we talked about the Great Awakening, we talked about the Enlightenment, we talked about mercantilism, and we talked about these things being things that Americans held to some extent in common, yet they were very different. And those differences come to light when we introduced the 4 wars for empire. Remember, we said, beginning in the 1690s, Britain and her allies and France and her allies are going to fight a series of wars. Now, in all likelihood, on the AP test, you will not see much about the first 3 wars. And you really won't see much about the 4th war. Remember, we said the 4th war for empire between England and France started in the backwoods of western Pennsylvania, right? It was George Washington, a 21-year-old son of an aristocratic family in Virginia looking to make a name for himself, that delivers the message to the French from the British that what is now western Pennsylvania was the property of the British, and that the French should get out. I mean, remember we said the Ohio River Valley, the area just west of the Appalachian Mountains, was claimed by Britain. It was also claimed by the French. And now in 1753 and in 1754, those claims are going to come to a head in a full-fledged dispute. And really, this is in the context of fighting 3 previous wars and having, a large French presence in Canada and in west of the Appalachians, and, a larger British presence east of the Appalachians. And the question was, what would happen? Would the British be relegated to the Appalachian Mountains? And would the French continue to possess the vast interior of what is now the United States and Canada? Or would the British be able to cross those mountains and expand, threatening New France? And so we said, this is what comes to a head in 54, when the British decide to send George Washington with an army to stop the construction of Fort Duquesne. We suggested that Washington's army encounters a detachment of French, and shots are fired, and Fort Necessity is constructed, and the first shots of what would become the 7 Years' War, and the 4th and final war for empire, occurs in the Pennsylvania countryside. Now, an interesting thing that we mentioned, and we spoke far more of this topic than they will ask you about on the AP test, because it is local history. We are from western Pennsylvania. Lots of things associated with the French and Indian War are around us. We know that. So we talked a little bit more about that, than ordinarily the AP is going to talk about. Probably what the AP would be more interested in anything would be in the Albany Congress, that is conducted in the context of this burgeoning war, right? Does anybody remember anything at all? Yakatich, do you recall anything at all of the Albany Congress? Yeah, it was called by the British, Kelly. It was called by the British, and the purpose of it was to persuade the neutral Iroquois Indian Confederation. Now, the AP loves questions about Native Americans. Now, I mean, we kind of put the Iroquois into the picture here as this 5-nation Indian Confederation that was powerful enough to kind of, swing this war one way or another, but they were not aligned with the French, which was rare. And the British wanted to get them aligned with them. And that the Iroquois had kind of really become quite expert at playing both sides against each other. But the purpose of this meeting was for delegates from the colonies to come together at Albany in New York and to meet with the Iroquois and convince them to join the British in this coming war between France and England. Oh, incidentally, why was it that most of the Native American tribes in America tended to support the French rather than the British? Go ahead, Alex.
It's the French were nicer.
Well, Alex, that's not a bad answer, and it's actually true, but we're looking for something a tad more sophisticated. Yes?
The French would trade like fur and stuff, like in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little better, Jin. Yes, go ahead, Alex.
That was what I was going to say. The trading was.
Yeah, the trade. I mean, and Alex is not incorrect. They weren't. The French were nicer to them. You know, they were. A better way to put it is the French were less intrusive. Cage. Is that a better way of putting it? But go ahead. You wanted to say something.
I was going to say the French treated them more like equals, whereas the British kind of suppressed them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the British kind of exploited them, suppressed them. The French partnered with them. You know, in like more ways than one. They married them, you know, they partnered with them economically. The French only had 60,000 French in all of New France. The British had well over 1 million people in a smaller area. If the British come to town, the Native Americans had to move. When the French came to town, the Native Americans incorporated with their kind of trading culture. You know, so you know, most Native Americans supported the French over the British and are going to align themselves with the French against the British in this conflict. The Iroquois was an exception, right? So, okay, you know, I mean, the war is coming, and, you know, we had Braddock and Braddock's defeat, you know, and, you know, that was being significant, and, you know, we said for a while it looked like it was going to go negatively, and in 1756, this war that starts in western Pennsylvania that we call the French and Indian War morphs into the 7 Years' War and is a fourth war for empire, a world war that is fought across the globe between England and France and their allies. What's really considered to be kind of the turning point in that war, and it's not really a battle per se. It's actually a kind of an administrative decision, yes. Yes, William Pitt takes over the war effort. He reorganizes it. He is successful in kind of, you know, deploying the resources of the British Empire that actually defeats the French. Now, Pitt, in doing this, spent a lot of money. He spent a lot of money. You know, he paid the colonists to do things, you know, and in the aftermath of the war, in the Treaty of Paris, I should mention one thing. We brought up the Albany Congress, but we really didn't talk about it. Let's go back to it for a second. Because the big significant thing we said about the Albany Congress was that in addition to you know, attempting to lure the Iroquois into a confederation, or into an alliance, which they don't really agree to, Benjamin Franklin proposed this plan of unity. And remember how excited I was when we talked about this in class, how excited I was that this plan for unity, the Albany plan to unify the colonies in kind of a colonial council that would oversee things that was of their mutual interest, and how all the representatives of Albany agreed to it, but when they took it back to their colonial governments, they all rejected it, the British rejected it, and how the point was, I said, isn't it interesting? It is 1754. And, you know, they proposed this minimal plan of colonial unity to defend themselves from the French and Native Americans, and they can't agree to it. And then, you know, what is it? You know, 22 years later, they unified to fight against England for their independence. And we asked the question, what happened? Well, one of the things that happened was the war that followed, and the changes that occurred in England. And the changes that occurred in England after the war is that Britain had defeated their most hated and feared foe, the French. They had banished the French from North America. The American colonists no longer had to fear the French on their border, right? This was now all Britain. And, you know, in doing so, they had amassed this tremendous empire. But they had spent a lot of money doing it. And so Britain had a lot of problems. They had problems managing, controlling the new empire they had acquired. They had problems, in managing, the trade of this new empire and mercantilism. And the big problem they had was money, paying their debt. So how are they going to do this? And really what becomes significant is in the aftermath of the Treaty of Paris, 1763, Britain attempts to kind of bring the colonial North America more tightly under the control of the empire. And they do this in a number of ways. One way they do it is with the Proclamation of 1763. Does anyone besides Jessica and myself remember what the Proclamation of 1763 was and what it was a response to, dear Jessica? Do you recall? Oh, dear Jessica, are you saying the Proclamation of 1763 proclaimed by Parliament established an imaginary line running through the Appalachian Mountains and suggesting that all white settlement had to pull east of that line? Hey, Gage, what was that a response to the Proclamation of 1763? Why do such a thing? Why pull all settlement east of a line that you had fought a war in order to acquire? Oh, Pontiac's Rebellion. Emily, I was sitting on Route 30 the other day reading a historical marker that said 4 miles down the road was the Battle of Bushy Run. Right? I should have taken one of the cell phone pictures, and then I could have sent it to you kids, and you could have looked at that while you were taking other classes. Like, how you look at my stuff, while in my class you look at the cell phone from other things. You could have done that. Would that have been good? Okay, not you other kids, bad kids. Jack Washington. Scrolling down, yes, looking, yeah, So yeah, I could have taken a picture of Pontiac's Rebellion. We know that's kind of, this Indian backlash against the British settlements, and it happened around here. And the British response is this Proclamation Line of 1763. And the colonists were furious with that. Hey, what was it? What did we say that the British did to try to bring trade under control? To try to stop smuggling, and force the merchants to comply with... Go, bro. Strengthen the Navigation Acts by a kind of an administrative, an enforcement tactic. Do you remember? We said this is significant. Right there and then, the child independence was born in that courtroom on that day. James Otis gave that argument against what?
Townsend Acts?
Not the Townsend Acts. In that courtroom on that day, Gina, the writs of assistance. So what was the writs of assistance about? These global search warrants were an effort to bring colonial America into line with the Navigation Acts. The writs of assistance marks a departure from salutary neglect. Up until the end of the French and Indian War, the British were content to allow the colonists to circumvent their laws, to smuggle around them. They didn't have the energy or the willingness to enforce mercantilism. But now, when things change in the aftermath of this war, they are going to try to use the writs of assistance to prevent this smuggling and to enforce and to pay the taxes that they think are necessary to protect and maintain their colonial possessions in North America. The colonists don't see it that way, right? They don't see it that way. Remember, we said that James Otis was hired by the colonial merchants to argue against the writs of assistance. And remember what he's going to argue. He is going to argue that the writs of assistance violated the colonists' rights, right? That this is not a matter of money, it's a matter of rights. And this idea of rights is going to, kind of influence a lot of things. Do we have the right? What gives you, Britain, the right to say that we can't cross this imaginary line? What gives you the right to say that we can't sell our products to whoever we want to? Well, on some level, the colonists are going to assert that they have certain natural rights, and that the actions that Britain takes is going to violate those rights. Now, certainly the Proclamation Line